In this video, Hikaru destroys Magnus Carlsen with 100% stockfish accuracy in the latest Title Tuesday tournament on chess.com. And no, there was no cheating in this game. I asked my very good friend Vladimir Kramnik, and he said the same thing, no cheating. Now, in the game, Magnus opens knight to f3, Hikaru goes d5, and then g3 for Magnus. So Magnus going for a fianchetto setup with bishop g2 and then short castles. Now, Hikaru, he goes g6. A very modern idea. Here you want to go bishop g7, then threaten out e5 and force out an early d4 from white. So here, bishop g2, bishop g7, and now here if Magnus castles, then e5 will be possible as that pawn is supported by the bishop. So here, Magnus not allowing that, he goes d4, gaining space in the center, the best move. And now Hikaru plays a very curious looking move, knight to d7. What's the idea behind this move? Well, he might want to support a future c5 break, but honestly, this is not the best idea. Instead, knight to f6, clearly the best move here, just maintaining a symmetrical position. But instead, knight d7 on the board for Hikaru, Magnus castles, and then knight to f6 for Hikaru. Now here, Magnus, he throws a little bit of a curveball. The main idea perhaps would be something like c4, gaining space on the queen side. Instead, knight d2 on the board. Magnus just mimicking Hikaru so far. Is Magnus mocking Hikaru? Let me know in the comment section below what you think. Alright, here, Hikaru c5, gaining space on the queen side, the best move. And here, Magnus returns the favor, he expands c4. And now we have that pawn square on the board. You know things are getting serious when the pawn square appears. Here, all sorts of possibilities are present. Now here, Hikaru castles, Magnus takes on d5, and black takes on d5 with the knight. Hikaru jumping in with the knight, trying to stay active. Now here, Magnus, he breaks the symmetry in the position. He expands in the center with the move e4 against Hikaru, and now Hikaru jumps in with the knight to the b4 square against Magnus. His idea is jumping into the d3 square, jumping into Magnus Carlsen's territory, and from there trying to win the bishop on c1. So Magnus, what does he do about it? Well, he has two good ideas here. The safe option is going to be knight to b3, intending knight takes d4 if Hikaru takes on d4. The other option is d5, gaining space in the center and maintaining a very asymmetrical position where he's fighting for the advantage. But instead, here Magnus, he just eggs on Hikaru. He goes a3, begging Hikaru to jump in with the knight. What does Magnus think he's doing? Let's find out. Here, knight to d3, Hikaru jumping in with the knight, and then Magnus, there is simply no way to keep the bishop. Obviously, the bishop has no good squares here. So, knight c4 on the board, Magnus trying to stay active with his knights, and then Hikaru just takes on c1. Obviously, the knight being attacked by the queen, so you have to do something right away. Knight takes, then rook takes, then Hikaru takes on d4, and now Magnus, at some point, is going to have to win back that pawn on the d4 square, but instead here, he breaks in the center immediately with the move e5, a very strong move. Now we have that e5 pawn wedge in the position. It does restrict black's knight on d7 and the bishop on g7, so here, Magnus is fighting for an edge, and his plan, in the spirit of the Catalan opening, the opening he loves so much, is to basically temporarily sacrifice the pawn on d4 and try to win it back later under more favorable circumstances. And by the way, guys, if you're enjoying this video, go ahead and smash that like button. Smash it right now. That like button is the best thing you can do to help me out. Now, back to the game. Here, Hikaru, he goes knight to b6. By far the best move. And there are several ideas behind this move. First of all, he is offering the trade of knights. For example, if Magnus takes on b6, Hikaru takes back with the queen on b6. From there, he's pressuring b2, and he has a great game. Beyond that, he is opening up this line of attack for the bishop. So the bishop not being able to enter the game on, say, e6, f5, or g4. And Hikaru, of course, does have the bishop pair in this position. So that is one of his main assets, and Hikaru trying to get his pieces active. Now here, Magnus, he does not want to trade off pieces. He goes knight to a5, pressuring the b7 point. Now, obviously, moving the bishop is not possible as that pawn on b7 would fall to the knight. But Hikaru has his ideas. Here, I do want to point out, there is an absolutely ludicrous computer move. You would have to be literally stockfish or a future world champion like Hans Niemann to find this move. The key idea is going to be bishop h6, pressuring the rook on c1, and if the rook moves, then you have the follow-up idea of going d3, maybe even d2, with that pawn being supported by the bishop on h6, and of course the bishop not being super active on this diagonal right now. But again, you'd have to be literally stockfish or literally a future world champion like Hans Niemann to find that move. But instead, here, Hikaru, he goes knight d7, kind of retreating the knight and putting pressure on the knight on a5. And now Magnus, he retreats his knight. So now we have the dancing knights going back and forth. Hikaru going knight b6 again. Magnus going knight to a5 again. And here, Magnus is offering a draw by repetition. If Hikaru goes back to d7, Magnus goes back to c4. They just dance their knights back and forth, back and forth. I can't draw arrows. Back and forth. And the game would be a draw by repetition. Whenever you have the same position in chess repeated 3 times in a row, it's a draw automatically. It's one of the rules of chess. But instead here, Hikaru, channeling Hans Niemann's stockfish energy, he finds the key idea, bishop to h6. Wow, incredible move. Okay, first of all, you are threatening the rook on c1. The rook has to go somewhere. Now, you may be saying, what if the rook just goes to, say, c2? Wouldn't that look logical? Well, then Hikaru, he would go d3, and he's threatening the rook after the rook moves again to, say, c3. Then you go d2, and that pawn on the d2 square is a permanent wedge being supported by the bishop. Black's up a pawn, up the bishop pair, and he's just dominating here. So, rook c2 would not work. Instead, Magnus Carlsen, he's forced to go rook to a1. There's simply no other good square for the rook. I mean, perhaps b1 instead, but that could be hit by future bishop f5 ideas. So rook a1, really the best square for the rook, but that is a sad reality for Magnus here. Now Hikaru increases the pressure. d3, threatening d2 in certain lines. Now Magnus b4, expanding on the queen side, not a bad idea. But here Hikaru increases the pressure with a series of very precise moves. First of all, he starts rook to b8, over defending the pawn on b7 and freeing up the bishop to enter the game on anywhere on this diagonal. Now Magnus, he goes h4, expanding on the king side. Not necessarily the best move, but this could be dangerous in the future. For example, if he gets in h5, threatening either h takes or even h6 in the future if the bishop moves. But now Hikaru, bishop g4, activating the bishop, putting pressure on the knight with all sorts of threats here. Now Magnus, he gets out of the pin of the knight, queen to b3. Now the knight is able to move, but then Hikaru, d2, further pushing the pawn and showing the complete idea of this bishop h6 maneuver. Of course, that pawn being defended by the bishop on h6, that pawn is just a monster here. All right, Magnus Carlsen, he's not out. He blocks the pawn with the move rook a d1, an excellent move. But then Hikaru, e6, blockading white's e-pawn. There are no e6 ideas. Now Magnus, queen to a2, increasing the pressure on the pawn. But Hikaru, queen d3, the very precise move, jumping in with the queen and putting pressure on the knight. Of course, now the threat is simply bishop takes, then queen takes, winning a full piece. That would be effectively game over. You can't give Hikaru a full piece advantage. So here, Magnus Carlsen, he takes the pawn on d2 with the rook. This is a sad reality. He has to give up the exchange. There's literally nothing else you can do here to defend. For example, instead, if you try to go, say, queen to b1, and that move looks logical at first glance. Obviously, if black takes the knight on f3 with the bishop, then you just go queen takes d3, winning the queen. But then Hikaru can just go, say, rook f d8, defending the queen on the d3 square. And again, the rook on d3 would be threatening the knight. It does support the pawn. I mean, that doesn't help at all. So, in the game, Magnus finds the best move, but again, it is a sad reality. Rook takes d2, giving up the rook for the bishop and the pawn. So rook takes, bishop takes, knight takes. Now Magnus is out of that pin on f3. He's sort of stabilizing, but now he is down a full exchange. Hikaru having those 2 rooks versus the 1 rook and the extra knight of Magnus Carlsen. That is a massive advantage. And now here Hikaru has a wide variety of ideas to increase the pressure. For example, queen e2 is good, knight d5 is good, bringing the rook to either d8 or the c8 square, also good. But instead here, bishop f5 on the board, not necessarily the strongest idea, but it's what he played in the game. Now Magnus, he fights back. Knight takes b7, winning a pawn, but now Hikaru, knight to a4, jumping in with the knight and threatening knight to c3 in certain lines. And now Magnus, he makes an absolutely fatal mistake in this game. Knight to c4. What is the problem with this move? Well, at first glance, the move looks very logical here. Magnus threatening either knight to cd6 or knight bd6. From there, the knights would support each other and be very, very strong. However, the problem is there is a tactical shot, the very obvious move, knight to c3. And look at this here. The queen has no way of defending the knight. For example, the only square you can go to is b3. But if you play that move, it runs into the immediate shot, knight to e2 check. With the discovered attack on the undefended queen, Magnus would lose the queen on the spot. So queen to b3, not a possibility. But with that in mind, after knight to c3, you can't defend the knight with the queen. Magnus here goes queen d2, but that means after queen takes c4, Hikaru wins a piece on the spot. Here, Hikaru literally up a full rook in this position. Both sides having 2 minor pieces, the knight and the bishop versus the knight and the bishop, but Hikaru has 2 rooks versus 1. I may have failed calculus in high school, but I do know that 2 rooks is better than 1. Hikaru in complete control here. All right, Magnus, he's not done. He starts to come back. Knight d6, hitting the queen. The queen moves back to c7, and then Magnus h5, the alpha 0 pawn, threatening h6, and maybe Magnus is going to be able to draw some sort of counterplay on the dark squares, potentially threatening queen g5, f6, then g7, checkmate, being supported by the pawn on the h6 square. All right, Hikaru, knight b5, retreating the knight, attacking Magnus Carlsen's knight on the d6 square. Now rook c1, hits the queen, queen to e7, gets out of the attack, then rook c5, Magnus jumping in with the rook, putting pressure on the knight on b5. Of course, the knight being attacked twice by the rook and the knight, so Hikaru has to defend, right? Well, instead, rook f d8 on the board, pinning the knight on d6 to the queen on d2 with tempo activating the rook. Very good idea by Hikaru, but now Magnus h6, the alpha 0 pawn. Again, he may have queen g5, f6, g7 ideas in the future. Magnus is not done. All right, now Hikaru, he takes the knight on d6. Knight takes d6, then e takes, then queen takes. Hikaru winning another pawn. Now the pawns are even, and Hikaru literally just up a full rook in this position. All right, Magnus, queen c3. The audacity of Magnus Carlsen threatening checkmate in literally one move. Of course, Hikaru is going to spot this. He goes queen d4, blocking the check. Now Magnus, he has nothing better than trading the queens. Queen takes, rook takes, then he goes rook c7. Now his last hope is some sort of combination of the back rank mate threats with that alpha 0 pawn on h6 and trying to win the pawn on a7 and then having 2 protected passed pawns on the queen side. But of course, Hikaru is on his A game, a5, trying to break up these pawns on the queen side. Magnus takes on a5, then rook to a4, threatening both the pawn on a3 and on a5. All right, rook c5 defends the pawn on a5, but then bishop e4, offering the bishop trade. Hikaru knows that as more and more pieces come flying off the board, his position gets better and better. So Magnus, he retreats the bishop, bishop f1, but then here in this position, Hikaru king to f8. There are no more back rank mate threats. For example, Hikaru can go rook b3, and if Magnus responds rook c8, king e7 is the move. The king gets out of the way of danger, and here in this position on move 39, Magnus Carlsen resides on the spot to Hikaru. He's down on time, he's down on material, he knows when he is beat, and Hikaru got the better of him in this game. Alright, Chess YouTube, what do you think of today's video? Let me know in the comment section below, and go ahead and smash that like button. And while you're at it, check out my Magnus Carlsen playlist, and I'll see you in the next video.